On the night of August 17, 1976, 5 men left their homes on the east side of Detroit and disappeared into the city streets. By dawn, the first violent confrontation had already taken place. Over the following days, 15 men connected to a single dispute would be hunted, cornered, and eliminated across parking lots, alleys, abandoned buildings, and dimly lit bars. All of it started over something trivial: a parking violation, a perceived act of disrespect. The perpetrators would later be identified as the Whitmore clan. 5 men bound not just by blood, but by a shared belief that in their neighborhood, respect was survival. Detroit in the mid-1970s was a city under pressure. Factories closing, unemployment rising, neighborhoods fragmenting into invisible borders enforced not by law but by fear. What began as an argument over a blocked parking space quickly escalated into a brutal chain of retaliation. One insult became a beating. One beating became a killing. And one killing opened the door to something far more calculated. Detroit police would later describe what followed as one of the most relentless urban revenge campaigns of the decade. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about drugs. It wasn't even about territory in the traditional sense. It was about pride, dominance, and the unspoken rule that any challenge had to be answered immediately and decisively. 15 men would lose their lives, entire families would be shattered, and a city already struggling to hold itself together would learn once again how thin the line was between order and chaos. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Detroit in 1976 was a city that no longer believed in second chances. The factories were still standing, but the promise they once carried had rotted from the inside out. Assembly lines moved slower. Paychecks shrank. Men who had built their entire identity around honest labor now stood outside bars at noon, nursing beers and resentment in equal measure. The city hadn't collapsed overnight. It had cracked quietly, block by block, until survival replaced ambition as the primary goal. The East Side was governed by unwritten laws. You didn't cross certain streets. You didn't park where you weren't known. And you never, under any circumstance, disrespected another man in front of his people. That was the mistake. It happened on a Thursday evening just before sunset, when traffic clogged the narrow streets around a failing auto parts warehouse that had been converted into makeshift apartments. A rusted Oldsmobile sat angled across 2 spaces, its rear bumper jutting into the lane. For most people, it would have been an annoyance. For the Whitmores, it was a statement. The Whitmore clan didn't operate like a typical gang. They didn't have colors or hand signs. What they had was lineage. 5 men, brothers and cousins raised under the same roof, taught the same rules, disciplined by the same father figure who believed weakness invited extinction. In their world, reputation wasn't something you earned once. It was something you defended daily. Earl Whitmore was the oldest, quiet, deliberate, and always watching. He didn't speak unless he had something worth saying. People mistook that for restraint. They were wrong. Earl simply understood timing. Leon was the opposite, hot-tempered, impulsive, and fueled by the constant need to prove himself. Where Earl calculated, Leon reacted. Where Earl waited, Leon struck. The city knew him as the Whitmore most likely to turn an argument into bloodshed. Marcus handled the money. Legal jobs, illegal side work, favors owed and collected. He kept the family solvent when others collapsed. He believed control came from information, not intimidation, though he was capable of both. Daryl and Raymond were the muscle. Not stupid, not reckless, just efficient. They didn't enjoy violence, but they didn't fear it either. To them, it was a tool, like any other. That night, Leon saw the car first. He leaned out the passenger window, cigarette dangling from his lips, eyes narrowing. The vehicle blocked access to a space the Whitmores had used for years, not because it was assigned, but because it was understood. That space belonged to them. Leon stepped out before Earl could say a word. "Who the hell parked this piece of junk?" he shouted, voice echoing between brick walls. A group of men stood nearby, laughing too loudly, drinking from brown bags. They were known faces, members of a rival crew that operated a few blocks south. Not enemies, not friends, just tolerated. One of them smirked. "Relax," the man said. "It's just parking." That was the second mistake. Leon crossed the distance in seconds, shoving the man back hard enough to spill his drink. The laughter died instantly. Eyes sharpened, bodies stiffened. "This isn't your block," Leon said. "Move the car." The response came as a laugh. The wrong one. The kind meant to humiliate. Earl finally stepped in, placing a hand on Leon's shoulder. For a moment it seemed like restraint might prevail, but the damage was done. Words had been exchanged in public. Pride had been bruised. The man shoved Leon back. Daryl moved. Raymond followed. The fight was fast and ugly. Fists, boots, bodies slamming into parked cars. No weapons. Not yet. When police sirens echoed in the distance, the group scattered, leaving behind blood on the pavement and a single message hanging in the air. This wasn't over. That night, the Whitmores gathered in silence. No yelling, no dramatics. Earl sat at the head of the table, eyes fixed on the wall as if replaying the moment frame by frame. "They disrespected us," Leon said, pacing, "in front of everyone." Marcus didn't disagree. He simply nodded. Earl finally spoke. "One incident doesn't make a war," he said, "but how it ends decides who we are." The next morning, the Oldsmobile was found burned out 3 streets away. By nightfall, one of the rival crew's associates was beaten so badly he couldn't remember his own name. And by the end of the week, Detroit would understand that a parking violation had become something far more dangerous. The opening move in a sequence of retaliation that would not stop until blood had balanced the scale. The Whitmores didn't rush. They planned. And once the plan was set in motion, there would be no turning back. Retaliation in Detroit never arrived loudly. It moved in shadows through conversations held in parked cars with engines running, in bar booths where jukeboxes drowned out voices, and in favors exchanged quietly between men who understood that survival depended on choosing the right side early. After the burned Oldsmobile was discovered, the message traveled faster than any official report could. The Whitmores had responded. Not randomly, not emotionally. With intent. The rival crew, men who operated out of a strip of bars and pool halls near Gratiot Avenue, met that same night. There were 8 of them in the back room of a closed tavern, smoke thick enough to sting the eyes. They underestimated what they were dealing with. To them, the Whitmores were local muscle, not strategists. That assumption would cost them everything. Earl Whitmore began mapping routines. Who opened which bar? Who walked home? Who drank too much and talked too freely? Marcus handled the information flow, listening more than he spoke, paying for details in cash and silence. Detroit was full of men willing to trade knowledge for a way out. Leon wanted speed. He always did. Every day that passed without action felt like weakness to him. But Earl understood escalation. You didn't strike to win the moment. You struck to control the aftermath. The first real hit came on a Tuesday morning. One of the rival gang's enforcers, a man named Harold Knox, was ambushed in a parking garage downtown. He wasn't killed. He was left alive, barely. Broken ribs, a shattered knee, a face unrecognizable even to his own family. The point wasn't death. It was warning. By evening, everyone knew who was responsible. The response was immediate and sloppy. A Molotov cocktail thrown through the window of a Whitmore-connected storefront missed its mark and set fire to an empty room. No injuries, no apology, just fear. Earl took that personally. "This is no longer about the car," he said during their next meeting. "They don't understand restraint." Daryl and Raymond began working nights, moving silently, watching, following. They memorized patterns, noted deviations. When men changed routes, it meant they were scared. Fear made mistakes inevitable. The second death happened outside a bowling alley. A rival associate was dragged into an alley and beaten to death with such precision that detectives later admitted it looked rehearsed. No witnesses came forward. Cameras malfunctioned. Detroit swallowed another body without comment. From that point forward, the city felt different. Bars closed earlier. Parking lots emptied faster. People avoided eye contact. The Whitmore name was spoken carefully, if at all. Not because they were loud, but because they were effective. Leon finally got what he wanted. 3 nights later, he cornered one of the men who had laughed during the parking argument. It was quick, brutal, personal. Leon didn't speak. He didn't need to. The message had already been delivered weeks ago. By the end of the month, 5 men were dead, and the war was just beginning. By October, Detroit no longer questioned whether there was a war. The only uncertainty was how far it would go. Police pressure increased, but it was uneven and reactive, always one step behind events already concluded. Patrol cars lingered longer in familiar trouble spots. Detectives asked the same questions to the same people and received the same silence in return. No one wanted to be remembered as the person who talked. The Whitmores adapted quickly. Earl understood that visibility was now the enemy. Violence had to continue, but unpredictably. No patterns, no signatures, no repetition. Each move needed to look disconnected, spontaneous, almost accidental. That was how you buried intent beneath chaos. Marcus began laundering information the same way he laundered money, through layers. Tips came from bartenders who heard too much, mechanics who fixed the wrong cars, girlfriends who asked the wrong questions. Every detail was verified twice. If something couldn't be confirmed, it wasn't used. Leon struggled with the shift. The early confrontations had fed something inside him. Now restraint felt like suffocation. He wanted finality. He wanted fear to turn into surrender. But Earl knew better. "You don't end wars by shouting," Earl told him. "You end them by making the other side disappear." The rival gang fractured under pressure. 2 members fled the city entirely, leaving behind apartments stripped bare overnight. Another tried negotiating through intermediaries, offering money, territory, apologies. Earl rejected all of it. Negotiation implied equality. There was none anymore. The next death wasn't loud. It barely made the news. A man was found slumped in his car in a grocery store parking lot, engine still running, radio playing softly. Official cause: blunt force trauma. No suspects, no witnesses. Just another Detroit statistic. But within the underworld, the message was clear. No place was safe. Not public, not private, not familiar. Daryl and Raymond handled most of the physical work now. They moved with discipline, never together, never rushed. Violence became procedural, target identified, window selected, exit planned, emotion removed. That detachment came at a cost. Raymond began having trouble sleeping. Not nightmares, those he could handle, but waking moments where the faces blurred together. Guilt didn't announce itself loudly. It crept in through exhaustion, through repetition, through the realization that every man they eliminated had believed he would survive the night. Meanwhile, the rival gang made a desperate mistake. They struck at a Whitmore associate who had nothing to do with the conflict. A mechanic, married, 2 children, beaten unconscious in front of his shop. The man survived, but the message crossed a line Earl had deliberately avoided. Civilians were off limits. That night, the Whitmores gathered without discussion. No debate. No dissent. Leon didn't pace this time. He sat still, jaw tight, eyes dark. "They want to spread it," he said quietly. "Make everyone scared." Earl nodded. "Then we finish it." The escalation was immediate. 3 men were taken out over 48 hours. Different locations, different methods, no warning, no theatrics, just erasure. One disappeared entirely. His car later found abandoned near the river. Detroit police formed a task force. Press conferences followed. Promises were made. None of it slowed the momentum. The Whitmores were no longer reacting. They were concluding. Marcus noticed something else too. The city had stopped resisting them. Information flowed freely now, not because people supported the violence, but because they wanted it over. Endings felt safer than uncertainty. The 15th target remained. He was careful, smart enough to know the pattern. He changed locations constantly, avoided routines, trusted no one. For weeks, he stayed alive by refusing to exist anywhere long enough to be found. Earl waited. Impatience killed more men than bullets ever had. The break came from an unexpected place, a parking attendant who noticed the same car returning late at night, always briefly, always gone by morning. A man trying to disappear still needed somewhere to stop. Leon wanted to go alone. No, Earl said. This one ends clean. When they moved, it was precise. Controlled, no witnesses, no chase. The city slept through it. By dawn, the war was over. 15 men were dead. The rival gang no longer existed as an organization. Just individuals scattered, silent, and afraid to remember what they had once been part of. The Whitmores didn't celebrate. There was nothing left to prove. But something fundamental had shifted. They had crossed from defense into dominance, from response into authorship. Detroit hadn't forced their hand anymore. They had chosen this path themselves, and once chosen, there was no undoing it. The city would move on. It always did. The Whitmores would learn whether they could. The problem with ending a war is that silence leaves room for reflection. For weeks after the 15th death, Detroit settled into an uneasy calm. The kind that didn't feel like peace, but like everyone holding their breath at the same time. Bars reopened. Parking disputes ended in muttered curses instead of fists. People learned where not to stand, where not to look too long, which names not to say out loud. The Whitmores didn't disappear. They simply stopped being loud. Earl returned to his routines. Morning coffee at the same diner. Afternoon walks through the neighborhood. Familiar faces nodded at him now with something between respect and fear. No one mentioned what had happened. That was the rule. You didn't survive Detroit by talking about things everyone already knew. Leon didn't adjust as easily. Without the urgency, the tension turned inward. He started drinking earlier, staying out later. Violence had given him direction. Now there was nothing to push against. No enemy left to justify the weight he carried. He replayed moments he couldn't change. Faces, sounds, the way bodies fell. He never spoke about it, but it showed in how his hands trembled when he tried to light a cigarette. Marcus noticed first. "You can't live like it's still happening," Marcus said one night, sitting across from him in a closed bar after hours. "It's done." Leon laughed without humor. "That's the problem. It doesn't feel done." Darryl took a different path. He threw himself into work, expanding operations, securing influence quietly. He understood something the others didn't yet. Violence was only valuable when it created leverage. And leverage needed to be maintained, not flaunted. Raymond kept his distance from all of it. He spent more time with his family, avoided familiar corners, pretended the city hadn't been reshaped by their actions. He believed distance could erase responsibility. It couldn't. Detroit police hadn't stopped looking. The task force lost momentum but not memory. Names stayed on whiteboards. Files remained open. Patterns were studied. Officers who'd grown up in these neighborhoods knew something fundamental had changed. Power had consolidated, and consolidation always left fingerprints. An anonymous tip arrived in late November. Thin, vague, but enough to reopen conversations, enough to justify surveillance. The Whitmores felt it before they saw it. Cars that lingered too long, faces that didn't belong, questions asked casually by people pretending not to care about the answers. Earl recognized the signs immediately. "They're circling," he told the others. "Not to charge, to wait." Leon slammed his glass down. "So what? We sit and hope?" "We adapt," Earl said calmly. "Like we always have." The mistake came from impatience. A small confrontation broke out over parking. Another violation, another insult, but this time it wasn't handled quietly. Leon stepped in where he shouldn't have, raised his voice, made a threat in front of people who watched too closely. By the next morning, word had spread, not about violence, but about arrogance, and arrogance drew attention. Marcus tried to contain the damage, leaning on connections, smoothing tensions, redirecting conversations. But once a story took shape, it didn't need facts to survive. It needed repetition. Raymond confronted Leon privately. "You're going to bring this down on us," he said. "All of us." Leon didn't argue. He didn't apologize either. "We didn't survive by hiding." "No," Raymond said quietly. "We survived by knowing when to stop." That night, Earl sat alone in his kitchen staring at a cup of untouched coffee. He understood the pattern forming. He'd seen it before, in wars overseas, in neighborhoods closer to home. Victors rarely knew how to live after victory. The city didn't need another spark. But sparks were inevitable when tension had nowhere else to go. The first arrest came quietly. Not a Whitmore, an associate, someone peripheral enough to test reactions. Charges unrelated to the conflict. Pressure applied gently, patiently. The message was clear. Detroit hadn't forgotten, and the Whitmores, whether they admitted it or not, were no longer just responding to threats. They had become one. The first arrest wasn't meant to break them. It was meant to measure them. When Victor Hale didn't come home that night, Detroit police knew exactly what they were doing. Victor wasn't blood. He wasn't family. He was close enough to matter, far enough to be expendable. The kind of man who knew things but didn't command silence the way a Whitmore did. Earl understood that immediately. "They're testing pressure points," he said, standing in the living room where so many decisions had already been made. "Seeing who bends first." Marcus nodded. "Victor won't last long if they lean on him." Leon paced the room, restless, jaw tight. "Then we lean back harder." "That's what they want," Raymond said. "A reaction." Leon stopped pacing and stared at him. "You think silence saved anyone in this city?" Silence had saved them so far, but it was fragile now. Victor broke within 48 hours. Not with confessions, with hints, with half-truths, enough to give detectives direction without giving them certainty. He talked about meetings, about tensions, about names spoken too often in the wrong places. He never said Whitmore directly. He didn't have to. By the end of the week, surveillance tightened. Unmarked cars appeared more frequently. Phones clicked faintly before dial tones. Neighbors who'd once looked away now watched too carefully. Fear had shifted sides, and fear always changed behavior. Leon noticed it first again. "You see how they're looking at us?" he said, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. "Like they're waiting for us to slip." "Then don't slip," Marcus replied. "That's not how this works," Leon snapped. "Once they smell blood, they don't stop." Earl called a meeting that night. No shouting, no threats, just gravity. "We don't expand," he said. "We don't respond. We don't correct disrespect with force. Everything stays contained." Leon laughed bitterly. "You think restraint is going to save us now?" "I think escalation will finish us," Earl said evenly. Raymond watched Leon closely. He saw something fraying, something that didn't care about strategy anymore. The city felt smaller every day. Bars that once welcomed them now fell quiet when they walked in. Old allies stopped answering calls. Power, once consolidated, had begun to isolate them. That was the cost no one talked about. Marcus tried to negotiate space, quiet conversations, old favors called in. But influence had limits, and everyone sensed the shift coming. People didn't want protection anymore, they wanted distance. Then Victor Hale was found dead. No witnesses, no suspects. Just a body in an alley 3 blocks from where he'd last been seen. The official report said overdose. No one believed it. Detroit police didn't accuse the Whitmores. They didn't need to. The message landed hard. Earl said nothing when he heard the news. He didn't ask questions. He didn't assign blame. He simply closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, like a man accepting that the path ahead had narrowed to a single direction. Raymond confronted Leon later that night. "Tell me you didn't," Raymond said. Leon didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was flat. He was going to talk. Raymond felt something inside him crack. "You just handed them everything." Leon's eyes hardened. "I did what had to be done." "That's what you said before." Raymond replied. Look where it got us. The next morning, Detroit woke up different. Police cruisers moved with purpose. Warrants were signed quietly. Judges who'd once hesitated now approved requests without delay. The task force expanded. State officers joined in. Federal eyes began paying attention. This was no longer about 15 deaths. It was about control. The Whitmore name, once spoken carefully, was now spoken openly in precinct rooms and news offices. Rumors spread faster than facts. The narrative took shape. A family that crossed a line and believed themselves untouchable. Leon didn't sleep anymore. Marcus barely spoke. Raymond avoided the house. Earl sat alone most nights, replaying decisions he could never undo. He realized something too late. Parking had never been the cause. It had only been the excuse. What followed had been building for years. Resentments, pride, the need to prove something in a city that took everything if you let it. The city hadn't changed. They had. And now Detroit was preparing to collect its debt. The knock didn't come at dawn. That was the first thing Earl noticed. No flashing lights, no boots on the porch, just a soft, deliberate knock at 2 in the afternoon, the kind meant to signal authority without spectacle. When Earl opened the door, 2 detectives stood there, calm, professional, already certain of their position. Mr. Whitmore, one said, we'd like to ask you a few questions. They didn't arrest him. Not yet. They sat at the kitchen table where plans had once been made, where brothers had debated right and wrong like it still mattered. The detectives asked about Victor Hale, about meetings, about disputes that went back years. Earl answered carefully, truth wrapped in omission. He'd learned that skill a long time ago. When they left, nothing felt resolved. That was worse than an arrest. By nightfall, the pressure spread. Marcus was questioned at his workplace. Raymond's name surfaced in a separate inquiry. Leon noticed a cruiser following him for 3 blocks before turning away deliberately, like a reminder. The city had shifted from watching to waiting. Leon couldn't handle waiting. He went back to the old places. The bars that smelled like stale beer and regret. The corners where respect had once been enforced with fists instead of files. He drank with men who remembered him differently, men who whispered instead of joked now. You should lie low, one told him quietly. Leon scoffed. That's what everyone says right before it's over. He didn't see the informant until it was too late. A young man at the end of the bar. Quiet, observant. Someone Leon didn't recognize, which should have been warning enough. The questions came slowly, disguised as nostalgia. Leon answered too much, fueled by anger more than alcohol. By the time Leon realized the mistake, it couldn't be undone. The arrest came 3 days later. This time, it was loud. Squad cars blocked the street. Neighbors watched from windows. Leon was taken in handcuffs for an outstanding warrant tied to an unrelated assault charge from years earlier. The charge itself was minor. The timing was not. Raymond arrived at the station hours later, powerless, watching as Leon was processed like any other suspect. The look Leon gave him through the glass wasn't anger. It was defiance. Earl understood immediately. This was the fracture point. With Leon inside, everything else became unstable. Associates panicked. Rivals tested boundaries again. Old enemies resurfaced, emboldened by the shift in momentum. The city, sensing weakness, began to close in from all sides. Marcus tried to hold things together, but leadership fractured under pressure. Without unity, control became impossible. Decisions conflicted, messages blurred, loyalty eroded. Raymond faced a choice he'd been avoiding for months: distance or loyalty. He visited Leon once before bail was set. The holding cell smelled like bleach and sweat. Leon leaned back against the wall, eyes sharp despite exhaustion. They think this breaks us, Leon said. It might, Raymond replied honestly. Leon smiled faintly. Then they never understood us. Raymond left with a weight he couldn't name. Earl spent the night alone again. He reviewed everything: the parking dispute, the first confrontation, the escalation he'd allowed because stopping it would have meant admitting fear. He saw now how inevitability had been mistaken for necessity. The Whitmores hadn't been forced into violence. They had chosen it. And Detroit was reminding them that choices had consequences beyond intent. Leon made bail 2 weeks later. He returned home thinner, angrier, and more convinced than ever that restraint was weakness. Earl saw it in his posture and the way he scanned the street. "This ends with them," Leon said flatly. "Or with us." Earl didn't argue. He knew the truth. There was no ending that didn't involve loss now. The task force submitted its final warrants that Friday. Coordinated, precise. Charges stacked carefully, built not just on violence but on patterns: conspiracy, intimidation, obstruction. The city didn't want revenge. It wanted resolution, and it was coming. Detroit learned how to hold its breath. The streets didn't quiet because things were over. They quieted because everyone sensed what came next would be final. Store owners closed earlier. Conversations stopped when unfamiliar footsteps approached. Even the sirens felt more distant, as if the city itself was conserving energy. Inside the Whitmore world, silence was no longer strategy. It was tension stretched to its limit. Earl convened the brothers in the basement of the old auto shop on Gratiot Avenue, the same place where they had once planned expansion, alliances, and retaliation without consequence. The walls were stained with oil and smoke, relics of a past where damage could be cleaned and forgotten. Now, nothing felt erasable. Marcus arrived first, carrying exhaustion like a second coat. He had stopped sleeping more than a few hours at a time, waking constantly to imagined sounds. Raymond came next, composed on the surface, fractured underneath. Leon was last, his presence filling the room with an energy that felt unstable, volatile. No greetings were exchanged. Earl spoke without preamble. "They're closing in," he said. "Not just on us, on everyone connected to us. Bank accounts, properties, old favors. They're dismantling the infrastructure." Marcus exhaled sharply. "So this is it. We run, or we wait to be taken." Leon leaned forward. "Or we strike." Raymond turned toward him. "That's not an option anymore." Leon laughed quietly. "It's the only option we've ever had." The argument erupted instantly, years of buried resentment rising to the surface. Marcus accused Leon of recklessness. Leon accused Raymond of cowardice. Raymond accused Earl of letting pride guide decisions that should have been strategic. Earl said nothing until the noise burned itself out. When silence returned, it felt heavier than before. "There's no winning move left," Earl said finally. "Only containment." They all understood what that meant: turning inward, cutting ties, sacrificing reach to preserve survival. Leon stood up abruptly. "I didn't survive a cell just to watch us fold." "This isn't folding," Earl replied evenly. "This is knowing when the ground is collapsing beneath you." Leon stared at him, searching for something: permission, defiance, approval. Finding none, he turned away. "I'm not done," Leon said. "With them, with this." He left before anyone could stop him. That night, Leon went where instinct took him. Victor Hale's old territory. The parking lot that had started everything sat nearly empty now, a cracked stretch of asphalt illuminated by flickering streetlights. The building beside it had new tenants, people who didn't know the history, didn't feel the weight beneath their feet. Leon sat in his car for nearly an hour, engine off, listening to the city breathe. He wasn't there for revenge anymore. He was there for closure. What he didn't know was that closure had already been arranged. 2 blocks away, unmarked vehicles waited. The task force had tracked Leon for weeks, mapping habits, predicting movements. This wasn't coincidence. This was convergence. Leon stepped out of the car and lit a cigarette, hands steady despite the adrenaline humming beneath his skin. He didn't notice the figures until they moved. "Leon Whitmore," a voice called out. "Police. Don't move." For a fraction of a second he considered running. not because he thought he could escape, but because running would mean the story continued on his terms. Then he saw the rifles. Slowly, deliberately, Leon raised his hands. The arrest was clean, controlled, almost respectful. The charges were not. Back at the Whitmore homes, the impact rippled immediately. Phones rang with coded messages. Associates disappeared overnight. Accounts were frozen. Properties seized under civil forfeiture laws that left no room for argument. Raymond watched the news footage alone. Leon's face was blurred, but Raymond recognized the posture, the defiance even in restraint. This time, there would be no bail. Marcus broke down quietly when he heard, not in anger but in relief he couldn't justify. The constant tension had finally snapped into certainty. Earl felt something colder. Finality. The next morning, warrants were executed simultaneously across the city. Businesses, storage units, secondary residences. Evidence gathered patiently over months now surfaced in coordinated precision. The Whitmore name, once spoken cautiously, now appeared openly in headlines, not as legends, as defendants. Raymond met with an attorney by noon. The word RICO entered the conversation like a death sentence spoken calmly. Patterns of behavior, chains of command, collective responsibility. There would be deals offered, but deals always came with costs. Earl stood alone in the auto shop that evening, the echoes of past conversations bouncing off the walls. He understood now that control had always been an illusion, that power borrowed time, but demanded payment eventually. The parking violation had never been the cause. It had been the excuse, and Detroit, patient and unforgiving, had finally collected its debt. Detroit did not celebrate the fall of the Whitmores. There were no cheers, no sense of victory, only a quiet recalibration as if the city adjusted its spine after carrying weight for too long. Life resumed not because justice had been served, but because the chaos had finally chosen an ending. The courtroom was colder than Earl expected, not physically, emotionally. Sterile walls, polished wood, faces trained to remain neutral no matter the history being dissected in front of them. Earl sat between Marcus and Raymond, all three wearing identical expressions of restraint. Leon's seat remained empty. He was already gone. The prosecution spoke in patterns, not emotions. Timelines replaced memories. Parking lots became ignition points. Surveillance photos stripped violence of its mythology and reduced it to logistics. 15 men. One escalation. A chain reaction that none of them had been able to stop once it began. Raymond listened carefully, taking notes he knew he would never use. He had always believed understanding could provide control. But understanding, he realized too late, only clarified how inevitable the collapse had been. Marcus avoided eye contact with the gallery. Somewhere among the spectators were families of the dead, journalists hungry for quotes, and people who had once benefited quietly from Whitmore protection and now pretended they had never known the name. Earl stared forward. He had lived long enough to know that courts did not judge intent. They judged outcome, and the outcome was undeniable. When Leon's recorded testimony played, the room shifted, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. Defiant, controlled, unrepentant. "I didn't start the war," Leon's voice echoed through the speakers, "but I finished what was brought to my doorstep." There was no apology, only justification. Earl closed his eyes briefly. He saw then what he had refused to acknowledge for years. Leon had not been the exception. He had been the purest expression of the Whitmore Code. Protect first, escalate without hesitation, never appear weak. A code that worked, until it didn't. The verdicts came faster than expected. Guilty, across multiple counts, conspiracy, racketeering, murder. The sentences varied, but the message was uniform. This story ends here. Marcus was led away, shaking, still trying to comprehend how a life built on movement and dominance could collapse into a single corridor lined with guards. Raymond followed, his mind already shifting into survival mode, planning how to endure time rather than command space. Earl was last. As he stood, he looked once more at the empty seat where Leon should have been. For the first time, he did not feel anger, only fatigue. Prison stripped the Whitmore name of its gravity. Inside, no one cared about Detroit. No one respected legends that existed beyond the walls. Violence was no longer currency, it was liability. Marcus withdrew inward, speaking less each year, aging faster than his sentence required. Raymond survived by observing, adapting, becoming invisible. He understood now that attention had always been the most dangerous thing a man could attract. Earl spent his days remembering, not the killings, the moments before everything hardened, conversations that could have ended differently, warnings ignored, pride mistaken for leadership. Outside, Detroit changed again. New gangs rose, new disputes ignited. The city did not learn lessons. It recycled them. The parking lot where it all began was repaved, the cracks sealed as if history itself could be smoothed over with asphalt. People walked across it daily, unaware that blood had once been spilled over something so small. That was the truth no one liked to face. Most violence is not born from necessity. It is born from ego, from the refusal to retreat, from the belief that respect must always be enforced rather than earned, from the illusion that escalation proves strength, when in reality it only accelerates collapse. The Whitmores did not fall because they were weak. They fell because they could not stop. And that, in the end, was the most dangerous trait of all. Final reflection and call to action. The story of the Whitmore clan forces an uncomfortable question. Where is the line between protection and destruction? At what point does defending territory become feeding pride? When does loyalty transform into obligation to violence? And how often do people mistake control for power, only realizing the difference when it's already too late? Many men convince themselves they are acting out of necessity, that circumstances leave no alternatives. But history shows a different pattern. Escalation is almost always a choice, even when it feels inevitable. The Whitmores believed every response had to be stronger than the last, that stepping back meant losing everything. What they never saw was that refusing to step back guaranteed exactly that outcome. If this story made you reflect about justice, revenge, or the cost of protecting what you love, then it has done its job. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Was the fall of the Whitmores unavoidable, or could one decision have changed everything? If you want more stories like this, raw, human, and rooted in the thin line between right and wrong, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us. Because some stories are not meant to comfort, they are meant to warn. Life moved on in Detroit, the way it always does, slowly, quietly, covering scars with layers of routine until they almost disappeared. Almost. Revenge did not bring back the dead. It did not heal wounds. It did not restore lost innocence. It only multiplied loss. The Whitmore clan believed they were defending respect, territory, and legacy. In reality, they created 15 new graves, 15 broken families, and a chain of consequences that no amount of power could stop once it began. They enforced a code, but lost their freedom. They eliminated rivals, but destroyed their own future. They won a battle, but lost the war against becoming exactly what they claimed to stand against. What started as a parking violation ended as a massacre, not because it mattered, but because pride refused to let it end any other way. And in the end, only one question remains. A question each of us must answer for ourselves. Was it worth it? If this story made you reflect on justice, revenge, and the true cost of protecting what we love, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to the channel for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about right and wrong, about law, morality, and how far people are willing to go when respect feels threatened. Comment below. What would you have done in their place? Where do you draw the line between standing your ground and destroying everything around you? Because these stories aren't just history. They're happening right now, somewhere in Detroit, somewhere in America, where systems fail, tempers rise, and violence still feels like the fastest language left. Until next time, remember, the monsters we fear aren't always born that way. Sometimes they're made, one ignored warning, one wounded ego, one irreversible decision at a time.